Continuing the Maid of Astolat from King Arthur and His Knights by Elizabeth Lodor Merchant. Presently she returned with the shield, and Lancelot handed his own to her. "Keep this shield until I come again," he said kindly. She took it like a precious thing, and little did the valiant knight dream how all the long hours he was away she would treasure it in her chamber, and muse over it, and dream upon it. Yes, press it close to her arms and kiss it, because it was his. Remember that Princess of Earth card that I showed? This kind of harkens to that sort of story. As she took the shield from him, she shyly asked if he would wear at the jousts a token of hers. "Fair damsel," said Lancelot, "if I do that for you, you may truly say that I do more for you than ever I have done for any lady, for never have I worn a token from any lady before this. But I will wear your token in my helmet right gladly." He thought to himself that thus he would, indeed, be well disguised at the tournament, for all the world knew that Lancelot had never worn a lady's favor. Then Elaine brought him a crimson scarf richly sewn with pearls, and not for an instant during the evening did her eyes leave the face of this brave and handsome knight who would wear her token in the tournament. The next morning Arthur and his knights departed from Astolat, and soon afterwards Lancelot and Sir Lavaine followed them. When they arrived at Camelot, remember Camelot's not part of the earlier versions of this, they went to the home of a rich citizen who was a friend of Sir Lavaine's father, and there were lodged, awaiting the tournament. Meantime, the city was filling with those who were to take part in, and those who were to watch the tournament. Every house was filled. Rich tents and pavilions were pitched in the surrounding meadows. Everywhere swirled the motley crowd. From the upper windows, the milling, colorful streets looked like huge rainbows, or mighty kaleidoscopes, ever-changing, yet constantly bright. But when the great tournament began, these streets were deserted, and the whole gay throng was packed about the lists. A truly noble array of knights was lined up at each end of the lists, awaiting the signal from the heralds' trumpets. The King of the Scots, King Anguish of Ireland, the mighty Sir Palomides, Mordred, Kay, and Griflet, to mention but a few of the most famous, were on Arthur's side, while the King of Northgalis, the King with 100 knights, the King of Northumberland, and Sir Galahad were against the king. Apart on the edge of their field, two silent figures sat their horses. Their shields were blank. No one might guess their names. One wore in his helmet a crimson scarf. Again and again Arthur's knights charged. Again and again his adversaries countercharged. Lance shivered upon shield, and shield clattered to earth. Down went horses and men. Swords were drawn, and the din of steel on steel filled the air. Now on one side, now on the other, was beaten back only to rally and come on again with renewed vigor. Broken armor, shattered spears, shorn plumes littered the ground. The ranks of both sides thinned, and many a riderless horse galloped frantically among the fighters, adding to the confusion and uproar. But by and by Arthur's knights began to beat back their opponents with the steady persistence that, to the trained eye of a soldier, told the ultimate defeat of Arthur's adversaries. When he saw this, the knight of the red scarf said to his companion, "It is our time. If you will help me a little, you will see the pursuers chased back as rapidly as they are now come forward." Well, imagine the possible humiliation if it was the sort of token that would be probably more common nowadays instead of a scarf. "Sir," said his comrade, "spare not. I will do what I may." And with that, Sir Launcelot and Sir Lavaine rode into the thickest of the fight with such a mighty charge that Launcelot unhorsed 4 of Arthur's men before he broke his spear, and Sir Lavaine smote down 2. Seizing another lance, Launcelot unseated 5 men, and Lavaine hurled from their saddles another 2. Then Launcelot drew his sword and laid about him so vigorously that many other knights were soon on the ground, and Arthur's party withdrew to the end of the lists in confusion. "Indeed, this is a most marvellous knight," said Sir Gawain to Arthur, "and were it not for the scarf he wears in his helmet, I should think it was Launcelot, for no other knight did I ever see do such deeds at arms." And perhaps I shouldn't use this word, but this term, but sympathetic magic can be considered how that sort of thing is. A fetish link, they call it, but some people are unfamiliar with the meaning of that word in that context. But the something related to something, particularly a possession of somebody or something somebody touched, and it forms a connection. Anyways, "I know who he is," said the king. "We shall know him better before he leaves." By this time the king's forces had rallied, and, heartily ashamed of their late reverse, they threw themselves upon their adversaries with renewed vigor, and especially they set upon the unknown knights. Then 3 set at once upon Launcelot, and Launcelot's horse was killed. A spear pierced Launcelot's shield and entered his side, the point breaking off in the wound. Lavaine, reckless with rage, threw himself upon the King of Scots, and knocking him from his horse, brought the charger to Launcelot, and despite the assault of all Arthur's knights, helped his fallen chief to the mount. A horse again, Launcelot, though sorely wounded, indeed, fearing that he had met his death, laid about him with mighty blows, and smote down many a noble knight, so that ere the joust was ended, he had overcome more than 30 knights, and Sir Lavaine, on his part, did marvellously well, for he that day unhorsed 10 knights, and most of these were of the Round Table. Then the king caused heralds to blow to lodgings, and after the trumpets had sounded and the knights laid down their arms, the heralds came forward with the prize to bestow it upon the knight of the white shield and the red scarf, for as yet Launcelot was unknown to them. Then said Launcelot, "My lords, if I deserve thanks, I have bought it at a great price, for I am likely to lose my life through this adventure. I am sorely hurt, and beg your leave to depart, for I had now rather have rest than be lord of all the world." With that he wheeled his horse about, and followed by Sir Lavaine, rode hastily away from the lists. At last they came to a little wood, and there halted. Turning to Lavaine, Launcelot said weakly, "I pray you to pull the spear from my side, for it galls me past all endurance." This Lavaine was loath to do, fearing that Launcelot would bleed to death. But as Launcelot urged, he at last seized the shattered lance, and with a great tug drew it from Launcelot's side. The wounded knight fainted. He remained in the swoon so long that Sir Lavaine feared that he was dead. But at last his eyes opened, and he begged his young friend to take him to a certain hermit not far away, who was a skillful physician. And, hermetics should not keep you from Physical prowesses. Presently they arrived at the hermitage, which was a large and comfortable house, set in a pleasant wood, for the hermit was a rich knight who had renounced the world through piety. There they were courteously received, and though the patient was unknown, the hermit undertook to treat his wound. But when the wounded knight removed his helmet, his physician recognized him as Lancelot, and doubled his efforts to make him comfortable and to repair his hurt. While Lancelot lay at the hermit's forest retreat, Arthur and his knights were seeking him. All agreed that so great a knight should not have been permitted to go away in such a desperate plight as he had left the lists. And not a few hinted that he had been foully dealt with. All admired him, though none but Arthur knew his name. And even those who fared worst at his hands in the tournament had nothing but praise for this brave and able knight. "By my head," exclaimed Sir Gawain, "I will find him." Forthwith he set out, accompanied by a squire, to scour the country. Into all the highways and byways about Camelot he went, and sought out all the retreats where a wounded man would be likely to go. Nowhere, however, could he find a trace of the Knight of the Red Scarf. Then Arthur set out for London, and Sir Gawain set out on a longer search more distant from Camelot. And so, one evening, he came to the castle of Sir Bernard, and sought shelter for the night. Of course, it was readily given him, and news of the court, and especially of the tournament, was eagerly inquired for by his host. You may be sure that Lady Elaine had plenty of questions to ask about the jousts. "There were 2 knights," answered Sir Gawain, "who bore white shields, and one of them wore a red scarf upon his helmet, and certainly he was one of the best knights that ever I saw joust, for I dare say he smote down 40 knights of the Round Table. His companion did right well too, and perhaps saved his comrade's life." Then Elaine, in her innocence, frankly told Gawain the story of the Knight of the Red Scarf, and how he had left his shield in her keeping, but had refused to tell them his name. "Show me the shield," said Gawain. So the shield was brought, and the case which covered it was pulled off. "Lancelot!" exclaimed Gawain, and in his turn he told how Lancelot had been wounded, and how he and his companion had ridden away, nobody knew where, and Elaine was very proud to know that her token had been worn by the knight of greatest prowess in the tournament, and that Sir Lancelot, who had never before worn a lady's token, had worn hers. Nevertheless, the news of his hurt, and she pictured him to herself, wandering, wounded, perhaps dying, with only her brother for a companion, nobody knew where. "Father," she cried, "let me seek Sir Lancelot and my brother, for never can I be happy until I find them." Then her father fitted her out for traveling, and she set off, and by chance found her brother at Camelot, where he had gone to have his horse shod, and with him rode to the hermitage where Lancelot lay. Sir Lavaine led her to Lancelot's chamber, and when she saw him lying there so weak and pale, who late had been so strong and full of life, she fainted. The brave knight was deeply touched by her devotion. Calling her to him, he kissed her, and, as she sat beside him, learned how she had found out who he was, and how she had sought him out. And the days passed happily for the wounded man, and for this devoted nurse. Elaine never left his side, and was ever eager to do what she might for his comfort. At last Lancelot was fully recovered of his wound, and joyfully he rode beside Elaine and Lavaine to their father's house. Sir Bernard received them with great rejoicing, and there Lancelot remained a little while before returning to Arthur's court. But when he was about to leave, the lovely Elaine came to him and begged him to take her with him. "Take me with you," she begged, "even as a servant, for I cannot live when you are away from me." "That I cannot, fair maid," said Launcelot sadly, for his heart was deeply touched by her devotion. "Truly I shall die if you leave me," pleaded Elaine, and despite Launcelot's attempts to comfort her, she burst into tears and, weeping softly, climbed the stairs to her chamber. From its window she watched the departing knight, in whom her whole soul was wrapped up. Slowly his horse bore him along the road which they had so joyfully ridden together a few days before. Smaller and smaller became his figure in the distance. At last it crossed a little hill and was gone. But the Maid of Astolat gazed long from her window. The stars came out and faded, and still she remained looking toward Camelot and dreaming of Launcelot. And when the morning came, she lay down on her bed and called for her father and her elder brother. "My heart is breaking," said she, "and I soon shall die. Let Sir Tirre write." Tirre? "And as I shall dictate, and let the writing be placed in my hand after I am dead. Then place my body on a barge draped in black, and put at the helm a trusted servant, and let the barge drift down the Thames to Westminster." Then she directed what her brother should write, and presently she died. Astolat and all the country roundabouts was filled with sorrow by the death of this gentle lady, for her goodness was of equal fame with her beauty. That's certainly important. Castle and peasant's hut were alike filled with grief, and willing hands hastened to prepare the funeral barge as Elaine had requested. They draped it with black satin, and with the flowers that Elaine had loved, and, when it was done, they placed the body of the unhappy lady, clad in her richest robes, upon a rich bed, covered with cloth of gold, in the midst of the barge. An old retainer of the family, clad in black, took the long steering oar, and the peasants pushed the boat into the current of Thames. Slowly it drifted down the stream, while the weeping friends of poor Elaine stood upon the bank and watched the receding barge until it had become a black speck on the shining river. Gaily passed the days at Westminster, where Arthur held his court. All the knights of the Round Table had gathered, and tales of adventure that they had experienced in their journeys entertained and thrilled the court. The great Launcelot, still shaken and weak from his wounds, the healing of which he had delayed by rash practice at arms before his side was fully knit, was there. His valorous conduct, when, as a disguised knight, he had entered the great tournament, was on every tongue, but his soul was heavy, for he thought often of the fair Maid of Astolat, and his brave and gentle heart was grieved because, through him, she had been brought so great sorrow. He pictured her mourning in her lonely chamber, high over the sleepy Astolat, nursing a hopeless love. Truly would he be glad to hear that she had found a new love, and he promised himself that if she did, he would dower her handsomely. But he was alone in his grief, and about him all was merriment, and the court echoed with light laughter. Now, one day, as they were strolling by the Thames, two knights espied a black dot far up the river. Lazily it drifted towards them, well out in the middle of the stream, but as it approached Westminster and began to draw near the bank, the watchers saw that it was a barge, heavily draped with black satin, which trailed behind it in the water. In the stern stood an old man, bent over the long steering sweep. Wondering what the strange boat might mean, the knights followed it until it touched the river bank. No one alighted from it, No word could they get from the aged man at the oar. Cautiously they peeped through the curtains. There upon a rich bed they beheld the loveliest lady they had ever seen, clothed in rich robes and strewn with garlands. They turned away, awestruck, and hastened to the king. Quickly the gaiety of the court was turned into curiosity, and the curiosity to grief, as the knights related their story, and Arthur and his queen and all his courtiers hastened to the riverside. Arthur and Guinevere alone entered the barge, and found all as the knights had described it. Great was their sorrow, and gladly would they have learned who the fair girl was, and why she had been brought thus to Westminster. But the lone old helmsman only bowed speechless in grief over the handle of his oar. And then the queen espied a paper clasped in Elaine's hand. Arthur took it, and the whole train returned again to the court. There, before all the courtiers, Arthur broke the seal. Launcelot had come in, having heard of the king's errand, with Sir Lavaine and others who had not been to the black barge. Slowly the king read, and as he read, all eyes were turned on Launcelot, for the paper told of poor Elaine's unreturned love for the great knight, and the heartbreak that had been brought her death. And the great-hearted Launcelot buried his face in his hands, and wept that such a fate should have befallen so fair a lady through him. Her brother, before the whole court, absolved Launcelot of any blame for her death, but this was small balm to the troubled heart of the generous knight. But in recompense for her devotion, a poor thing, but all that he could do, he caused her to be richly buried at Westminster, and all the knights and ladies of the court attended poor Elaine's funeral mass. Then the black barge turned up at Themis, and the solitary boatman slowly rowed it back toward Astolat. Slowly, slowly, the black boat glided up the stream until it was a black speck on the shining water. So ends the tale of the Maid of Astolat. And, just because there's journeys where you can't be taken with you, maybe sometimes that's the best thing for a person, right?